It's my pleasure to chair this second panel. My name is John Sandage. I'm with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and you'll be hearing a little bit from me tomorrow. This panel is got a very interesting title, Corruption as a Facilitator of Criminal Associations. And before I invite the three panelists to make their presentations, and then we'll have some time for discussion after they're finished, let me first briefly introduce them. Margaret Beare, who we've heard from already this morning, is Professor of Sociology and Law here at York University, and previously she served within the Department of the Solicitor General of Canada as the Director of Public Policy, and for 10 years she was the Director at the Nathanson Center for the Study of Organized Crime and Corruption here at Osgoode Hall Law School. To my right is Julian Sher, who is the Senior Producer of the CBC program, The Fifth Estate, Canada's premier investigative TV show, as I've been told. He also has been an investigative journalist for Canada's two leading newspapers and is the author of several books on the topic that we'll be discussing today. And finally, Frederick Martens, who is the former executive director of the Pennsylvania Crime Commission, and I understand that the commission was in fact shut down after investigating the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, and Frederick is going to tell us a bit more about that, as well as about some of his experiences in investigating organized crime and corruption cases in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania for 50 years. So without further ado, I'm going to begin with Margaret.
Thank you very much, and really thank you for being here. It's so terrifying. It's like sort of the notion that you're helping to sort of throw a party and you don't know whether anybody's going to for sure actually come. So I'm delighted that you're all in the audience. I try to go every year to a conference in Cambridge where they've got a system where if you speak over time, a gong goes off and you literally cannot talk through it. So John can sort of keep me under control, maybe hopefully without sort of the necessity of the gong. So our panel is obviously and decidedly and purposefully different than the first one. What we're looking at is the relationship between corruption and organized crime. The title of mine is The Enemy is Us, and that is the title of the final chapter in William Chambliss's book called On the Take. And in that book, he's talking about the ubiquitous system of payoffs and favors, back-scratching, stealing, illegal campaign contributions, and personal aggrandizement that characterize the linkages between organized crime, politicians, law enforcement, and business people, all ultimately involved in corruption and all allowing organized crime to flourish in the United States. Chambliss was specifically talking about the United States. I'm going to be looking, the first panel was looking internationally. I'm going to be sort of looking more domestically. And in terms of sort of the motivation for my paper, sort of how I framed it, is around sort of launching off a sort of two publications. One was a recent book by Zephyr Teachout titled Corruption in the United States. And what was important for me in terms of that book was her historical look at the evolution from going from a point where it was a criminal offense to take anything if you were a public servant. So there's sort of great discussions of jeweled snuff boxes and the criminal charges that would flow to the presidents or presidential people who would accept those gifts from international officials. Until you get to the point now of super PACs. And the whole notion that the U.S. election is estimated, and we'll likely go over that estimation, but the 2015 election is estimated to cost something like $6.5 billion. And of course, the super PACs is a major source of that. As I have in my paper, Jimmy Carter, the spoiled sport, referred to the PACs as legal bribery. Chambliss, in his study, made mention of the fact that the expense of a typical U.S. election is one candidate's mob is another's ticket to the White House. So the relationship of even this morning's panel talked about the importance of political campaign funds and how that relates to corruption and, in some cases, organized crime. Teachout talks about sort of how you go from a whole series of legal manipulations that resulted in the final decision that the corporation was a citizen and therefore corporations could engage in the contribution game. We in Canada have an election process that is much shorter. The limits on campaign funding are much more severe. There may be ways to work around it, and there's always controversies about it, but nevertheless, it's much more limited. But when you look at the Charbonneau inquiry, you have to conclude that even in Canada, the campaign funds was not an insignificant motivator for the corruption. So the second, that was sort of the first sort of basis that I was sort of interested in. The second one is nothing but a newspaper article by Lisiane Gagnon, who wrote an article criticizing the Charbonneau inquiry. Her article was called An Expensive Disappointment. I am not refuting her view, and I'm not defending the Charbonneau inquiry. I'm using the Charbonneau inquiry to some extent as sort of a lesson in terms of some of the things that we should be able to generalize, that we have, in fact, even in this early stage of the inquiry, which is really just the testimony. The report itself hasn't come out. But there are at least 3 aspects to her criticism that I think maybe speaks to a misunderstanding, or at least in my view, a misunderstanding of the issues involved in corruption. So the 3 criticisms that I'm going to look at, first of all, the failure to reveal how the mafia infiltrated Quebec's construction industry. Well, I'm not sure quite what more information she needed in terms of sort of indicating how the mafia infiltrated the construction industry, but there are some important issues there that have perhaps not come out. Certainly, in terms of my argument, there's sort of 3 main reasons. Mutual greed and opportunism, certainly. The need for a policing function in the underworld, or in terms of a policing function to police illegal activity. And finally, and perhaps the most obvious of all, the ability to use force and intimidation. I'm going to start with the final one because that's the one that anybody that's been following the Charbonneau inquiry will be sort of perhaps the most aware of. We have a quote by Serge Perreault, former director of procurement from Montreal. It's common knowledge that bosses who try to enter the Montreal market are physically threatened, their homes are vandalized, their equipment is damaged. It's a kingdom within a kingdom. We have another testimony by Martin Courier, who received a phone call, the phone call turns out to have been from an enforcer from the Rizzuto family. And the message was, never mind who I am, because the next time you won't be walking away. Thank you and have a nice day. And whenever anybody says, have a nice day, apparently you have to make sure that you have a safe day. Perhaps the quote that everybody sort of caught in the media was Nicolas Miliotto telling another man, Martin Dumont, former political aide to one of the unions, "You know, Martin, my sidewalk foundations are thick and deep. You don't want to end up in my sidewalk foundations." So clearly, the ability to use violence, to threaten, to intimidate is an important factor. But the point I would like to make, it's only one of the ways. The second is what I mentioned, this idea of a policing function. Whenever you're engaged in an ongoing pattern of anything, somehow it's got to be controlled. It's got to be, somebody's got to manage it, if you will. Diego Gambetta, criminologist, argues that protection is in fact the main activity of the mafia. The ability to determine who is allowed to compete in a particular market at a particular time and get a particular contract. So in terms of how the mafia was able to invade or get itself involved in the construction industry, it was providing a service, as well as, again, the idea of force and all the rest of it. A study out of Russia, using Russian organized crime, talks about the mafia providing quite an array of services: protection against competition, enforcement of the cartel agreements, provide protection against theft and police harassment, the ability to settle disputes. So there are services that were actually rendered. The third point that I think is important in terms of trying to understand why the mafia and the Hells Angels were so integrated with the construction company is sort of a misunderstanding even in terms of what organized crime is. I argue that we have to be careful when we sort of differentiate between organized crime, the mobsters, Hells Angels, and whoever else, as compared to people who have been infiltrated. It is possible that those people who were so-called infiltrated are as much criminal as the recognized mafia, Hells Angels, or whatever. And I'm quoting here Robert Blakey, who drafted the U.S. RICO statute, which is the international model, I suppose, of organized crime legislation. He argues that if officials operate like racketeers, they are racketeers. They are part and parcel of the criminal network. And to sort of illustrate Blakey's sort of original point about but you can be a racketeer no matter what color the collar of your shirt is, in May 2013, in terms of who got charged and convicted of being a gangster under our Canadian legislation, was the former Laval mayor, Guido Vaillancourt, so-called the King of Laval, the former city manager, the former director of engineering. Together, it was argued that they operated as an organized and structured network. They are organized crime, or they were organized crime. They were all charged with gangsterism. What I'm arguing there is that I would prefer that we think of, or we worry about, organized crime as something that tends to be embedded into our society. That's not to say we don't need to do something about it, but they don't wear funny jumpers, they don't look different than anybody else. To some extent, they are us. So to answer to Agagno's question, how did they infiltrate? They infiltrated because there were officials who were greedy and saw an opportunity. They infiltrated because was not possible, likely, for the construction company and the government to continue on a pattern of collusion without some kind of policing function. And the final way was this idea that we need to open our minds to possibly a broader interpretation of organized crime. The next point that she said, there was a failure to uncover a single case where a specific contract was obtained in exchange for a political contribution. And I believe that was touched on this morning. And this sort of, again, to go back to sort of the US experience, this is what fell out of one of their court decisions that said that a quid pro quo exchange only was corrupt when there was a specific gift in exchange for a specific agreement. So, Gagnon is probably correct. The inquiry to date has trouble finding a specific gift, a specific payment in terms of a specific activity. But that's not the point. The point is that we're concerned with an ongoing pattern of activity within an environment of exchange. An ongoing pattern of activity within an environment of exchange. With the help of a graduate student, I can do squares and lines, but I can't do other things. Tried to sort of capture the money flow linkages that have come through in the testimony of the Charbonneau inquiry. Only sort of indicative of this, a pattern of interactions. So as I say, Gagnon may well be right that the one-to-one, specific for specific, might not have come through clear. But what did come through numerous times is the ongoing pattern of exchanges. One of the problems they had was even with the former Liberal Transport Minister, Julie Boulay, who worked at Transport for 7 years, and she expressed to the inquiry great surprise. She couldn't understand why the construction companies paid so heavily into contributing to the political party, even though, of course, the Transport Ministry was a great giver of contracts. So that is a major issue. One of the things that my paper looks at is, to some extent, our ambivalence, and certainly the ambivalence of some of these people to the criminal activities they were engaged in. One construction boss, Sambito, was accused by the commissioner of paying protection money to the mafia. He said, "I saw it more like business. Entrepreneurs make money, and there's always a certain amount that's owed to people." And it didn't matter that the money that was owed was to the mafia, because he said, "We're old family friends. We grew up in the same community in Italy. Like, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? What's all this fuss is about?" Just to really show what you can do with squares and boxes and lines and swirps, here we sort of tried to capture basically the Charbonneau inquiry. Sort of at the last edition was the role of the union in the whole thing. So again, your 3%, your 2.5%, your whatever, is the money moving sort of back and forth in that kind of a situation. And that just was really just meant to show the extent of the exchange relationships between supposedly legitimate officials, bureaucrats, people with white collars, as opposed to these mobsters, Hell's Angels, sort of whoever. The final issue that she raises is this idea of guilt by association. She was very upset, and perhaps rightly so, because people's reputation do get sullied, no matter what the inquiry is. And so she was concerned at the long list of names that the RCMP, I guess, tabled with the commission in terms of keeping, well, some of you who have been following it at all know that a major source of information for the inquiry was a long-standing police investigation where they had wiretapped a club, a social club, the Cosenza Social Club. And she was arguing that just because people came in and out of the social club, what's the big deal? Their names shouldn't have been mentioned. And I just want to sort of talk for a moment about the role of social clubs in the world of organized crime. This social club was, in fact, the office, the business, the base of the senior Nicola Rizzuto. That's where he did his business. Vietnamese store owners having trouble with gangs, he goes to this club in order to get Rizzuto's help. Rizzuto has commands for his underlings. He gives it to them at that club. 74 construction companies came in and out of that club on an ongoing basis. And that man, Mr. Sidewalk, the guy who's considered to be sort of one of the bag men, I didn't write down the number of visits that he made, but he was in and out of there all the time. We don't particularly care too much about that social club. It was sort of interesting because it was reminiscent of New York in the 1970s, 1980s, when the FBI were able to put a wiretap above the Mulberry Street Ravenetti social club. And it was that wiretap by the FBI that were able to get John Gotti, and some of the rest of the Gambino crime family members. Blakey, who I mentioned before, talks about the social club in Chicago, West Side Democratic Club, and I thought it was sort of interesting because it was a conversation between Sam Giacconi, I know I'm destroying the Italian names, and a congressman. And they're discussing how many votes the congressman should get. And the congressman says to the mobster, well, I want it to look a little better than that. I want it to look like a closer race. So these clubs not only seem to be the club of the business office of choice for mobsters, but it also seems to be a prime location for wiretaps. So as I say, her point that maybe some reputations were sullied is possibly true. That's also true of a lot of inquiries, but I think in this case, anybody that would be coming in and out of that club probably had business with the Rizzutos. I think you're going to get another sort of slide from one of our next speakers that sort of, it was just so dramatic to actually see the RCMP's wiretaps of the room in this club. And there you've got Rizzuto Sr. stuffing money into his socks. Now, you'd think that he'd have a nice bag or something, but nevertheless, I guess push come to shove, you stuff money into your socks. Leonard Cohen just turned 80 this year, and we're talking about Quebec, so let's quote Leonard for a moment here. Everybody knew. So the question, and it was a question in this morning's panel, if everybody knew, why did nothing get done before? Everybody knew that dice was loaded. Everyone knew, rolled with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the fight was fixed. That's how it goes. Everybody knows. So why didn't something get done beforehand? Mr. Martens is going to tell us in sort of quite glowing detail the risks that are involved in doing anything. So in terms of the dangerousness of taking on a corruption case, unless you have tremendous power, but in his example, even having tremendous power doesn't save you. So I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to raise an issue. William Chambliss, again, we started off with him, so let me mention him again. He said that in addition to the question, why was it allowed to go on, he said an even more interesting question is, why did it happen at all? Why was the inquiry called? And of course, when you sort of look at this one, it wasn't a natural thing. It was fought for years. And often, and certainly in terms of Chambliss's example, you have exposure when it's to the advantage of the opposing political party to do the exposing. And the idea being that some dirty stuff will come out, but it's almost like it can be part of a political process. Corruption can be very useful. That would be another reason. And it's certainly useful from those people who are in a position to stuff their pockets. So that always sort of affects it. I wanted, just in terms of that section, to quote from the State on Trial book, a colleague of mine, Lior Salter. We tend to think that individuals are to blame if they do not object before a crisis, injustice, or tragedy happens. But often individuals operate under real constraint. The real culprit are often institutional inertia and real-world circumstances, neither of which is amenable to whistleblowing. There's a complex of reasons why nothing was done before, and perhaps inertia is one of those reasons. I'm running out of time, but I wanted, maybe I've got a couple more minutes. I wanted to sort of look at the role of law enforcement, both in terms of the police and Revenue Canada. Interestingly, wonderful quotes that the RCMP, as they said, they weren't interested in corruption. Even when they were watching these tapes, the speaker said, the tape was rolling, but we weren't listening. We weren't listening because we didn't care about corruption. We cared about the Rizzutos only in terms of their drug trafficking. So that's quite an incredible thing, that you can have this level of corruption, and the RCMP saying, now it may have had to do with their authorizations, but if they cared, they would have gotten sort of different authorizations. Trying to sort of, on that big chart, you did not see the police listed as being complicitous in organized crime, but if there was a link, it was probably to the ex-chief who did admit to some irregularities and partnerships with mobsters, which is never a good thing. Revenue Canada is equally interesting, because while they were assisting the commission to trace some of the money, they themselves fell under investigation because some of the money they were tracing ended up in their pockets. So who is above corruption? Not the police, not revenue. And I guess then, just to sort of conclude, what we're looking at is when we're just did another edition of Criminal Conspiracies, Organized Crime in Canada, and virtually every organized crime market, you could see how easily and how factually it was facilitated by corruption. And just as just a quick, Nigel Hodgkins, who actually spent some time at Osgoode, he's now heading up an Australian agency to fight corruption. But his point is that the police need to take it seriously. They need to prioritize it, even in terms of how resource extensive it is and how difficult they are and how dangerous they are to successfully bring to fruition, that it needs to be a priority. Because when we look at organized crime markets, basically, as I said, everyone is facilitated by corruption of officials. Russian organized crime, smuggling, trafficking, child pornography is interesting, because when you look at who the market was, you'll remember it was everybody: school teachers, judges, doctors, police officers. Money laundering, I'm always sort of whining about the fact that in Canada, unlike in some countries, our lawyers get to get their financial fees from dirty money. And also, they are exempt from the Financial Action Task Force reporting techniques. So in terms of money laundering, your lawyers, your accountants, very valuable for any scheme that's sophisticated in any kind of a way. And then, of course, sort of the whole notion of, well, gambling. One of the things that the police will tell you is very hard to sort of fight illegal gambling, because the table is often full of police officers and judges and whoever else. drugs is a major problem, because one of the major aspects is the corruption of police officers that illegal drugs tends to breed. And I guess just a final sort of comment, when they looked at it in New York, the Mullen Commission talked about how the drug unit there was actually operating as an organized crime operation. And I guess without sort of stressing the point too much, the drug corruption case in Toronto certainly looked to some extent like this drug unit that the Mullen Commission was talking about. So absolutely, to conclude, my major point then is this idea that when we're looking at corruption, when we're thinking about organized crime, move away from the stereotype of the leather jackets, the patch, the Italian accents, the this, that, whatever, and look at it in a much broader kind of a way. And just to conclude, then, the enemy is us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret, for reminding us that the grease of money and how it facilitates the linkages between organized criminal behavior and corruption, and especially corruption of public officials. Now we're going to turn to Julian, who, as a journalist, I suspect is going to give us some of his experiences on how we actually shine the light of public scrutiny on corrupt behavior. So Julian, please.
Thank you. My apologies for being on my phone, but we do have a show to put to air this Friday, which I'd encourage you all to watch. It's not about corruption, but it's a good show at 9 p.m. I've been working as a journalist for all my life, and I spent a good part of that dealing with organized crime. Margaret talked a lot, obviously, about the Charbonneau Commission. It's important to remember that that commission started because a couple of colleagues of mine who work at our sister program, Enquête, got a brown envelope that pointed to some irregular spending by a union leader, which led them to investigate his ties to the Hells Angels, and the rest is history. After 2 years of constant reporting where most of the politicians, the government at the time, and even the police force refused to look into corruption, it was investigative journalists that forced the hands of government, and the rest is now history. I just want to share briefly with you some of the things that I've learned over the years. I've written these 2 books on the Hells Angels in the United States, around the world, and in Canada. I've met a lot of bikers. I've obviously met a lot of police officers who try to deal with this function of organized crime and the mafia. And when I worked at the Globe and Mail and the Star, I covered both global corruption and some of the corruption issues that we face all the time. Now at the Fifth Estate, we've covered corruption quite often over the years. Last year we did a short story on mafia infiltration in the unions here in Toronto. Just in passing, by the way, does anybody know how many police officers there are currently in Toronto or in the GTA working full-time on corruption? Yeah, exactly. In Montreal right now, there are over, I think at last count, between 100 and 200 officers from the municipal police force, the SQ, working full-time on corruption. In the GTA, as far as I know, the police do not have any kind of organized corruption squad. They might look at fraud. They have other officers who are looking at mafia investigations. There is no corruption investigators working full-time. We did a story last year on the Scotiabank. The Scotiabank is Canada's biggest international bank. They're huge in Mexico. One of their senior bank managers was murdered. And what our story revealed is her connections to money laundering. In fact, she was a victim of another executive who was charged with money laundering. And the Mexican authorities were far from satisfied from the collaboration and cooperation they got from Scotiabank. Also, probably most of you didn't hear about this story because Scotiabank didn't exactly announce it in their regular press releases. And it's worth watching the documentary because you'll see a very telling interview from one of the chief spokespersons of Scotiabank. Crime pays. That's the main thing I learned in the last 30 years. Some guys and gals, I guess, get into crime because of the sex appeal or for whatever reason. The main reason they do it is because they're business people. It pays. They make a lot of money. And the problem is, actually, just to illustrate the money, we had some video problems, but this should work. This are excerpts of police surveillance of what became known as the Nomads Bank in Hells Angel. There was an apartment in northern Montreal where it was rented out. It was only for a counting machine. The police in part found out about it because of the constant noise of that the machine was making. We're talking millions and millions of dollars a day. And what the police did is they set up surveillance cameras. I'm going to show you an excerpt of all the different people, soccer moms, kids with hockey bags, businessmen walking in to take out the money. The police were able to go inside. They set up a camera inside the room so they could film the counting. And they also went in every day and swapped out the hard drive to get accounting ledgers, which you'll see in a moment. So this is just a sample. The video quality, of course, is not that good, but take a listen. The music is mine. Now, you notice how heavy that bag was, right? What's one of the problems that we'll talk about for criminals? Walter Stadnick, charming fellow I followed for a long time, and I sat in on his court hearing when he eventually got sentenced for 18 years. One point, he was stopped in Winnipeg, with over $80,000 in his bag. He was charged with various offenses. The police found traces of cocaine on the money, and they were prepared to lay charges. That was one of their aspects of proof. They then did a random test of money just generally in circulation, and they found that there was cocaine on a lot of other money. So they actually couldn't use that as evidence. He was eventually, the charges were dropped, and he walked away. I don't remember what happened to the money. This is from that money machine you saw. When they seized the hard drive, this is part of the bank accounts they found. His code name was Gertrude, and you could see he had a nice balance of $1.7 million. Now, you notice how heavy the bag is. This is a problem for criminals. The problem for criminals is too much money. You know, $1 million weighs 20 pounds, and if you stacked it up in just $100 bills, it would be 4 feet high. What are you going to do with all the huge profits you're making from drugs? Well, you can do several things. You can hide it. There was a Quebec couple who were renovating their bathroom, and they found over $100,000 that had been stuck there, probably paid for part of their renovations, from this organized criminal member of the Hells Angels. They can invest it. These two guys were making $2.7 million annually in the drug trade. They set up a technology company. It was traded on NASDAQ. They used it as a pump and dump, and they cashed in before the collapse. And one of them was already in jail doing this while this was going on. So they can they can invest it. They can also buy things. There was one BC biker I knew who, before he was 30, had bought $1 million condo in the Wall Street Tower, then bought a $1.7 million home in the Southlands, and also had more than 5 cars. They can also buy people. Normand Roberge was one of the key cops who's profiled in my first book. He was the leading investigator who took down the Hells Angels, put more than 100 in jail, was a regular source of mine over the last 10 years, and then, as some of you may know, was found to be trading secrets for cash to the Hells Angels and is currently serving a multi-year sentence in jail after he pleaded guilty to corruption. So they can buy cops like him. I had breakfast with him a few months before he was arrested. Alan the Weasel was one of the most famous drug pushers in Toronto, in Montreal, part of the Irish West End gang that cooperated with both the Italian mob and the Hells Angels. We were investigating his ties to Claude Savoie, who was the top Mountie drug officer back in the 90s, then moved on to head intelligence in Ottawa. And a day before we went to air with our story, Claude Savoie committed suicide at our RCMP headquarters. And after the investigation found out that there was cash in his safety deposit box, and there was clear evidence of him being corrupted by organized crime. They can also launder it. It's not for nothing Canada is known as the Maytag of the North. There are 3 stages of crime. Criminals often start off as a street thug. Walter Stadnik used to go around break knees for the mafia. Then you become a crime boss like Maurice Boucher or Vito Rizzuto. And then you become a respected businessman. Bootleggers in Canada went on to become respected businessmen. And that's what happened to Vito Rizzuto. Margaret talked about it. Vito and his family run many open businesses. Many prominent Italian mobsters have huge industries which they use to launder money and also to deal with other so-called, quote, legitimate businessmen. The Nathanson Center, has pointed out some of the common techniques used for everything from nominees to legitimate revenue to smurfing to launder the huge amount of money. Because you have to realize what a problem this is for the Italian mafia, for the bikers. We're talking millions and millions that they have to be able to launder. So they use everything from restaurants to casinos. And this is an example of the various sectors, according to the Nathanson Center, used for money laundering. And talking about Scotiabank or the other banks, you need a big legitimate bank to move money. I remember there was a policeman told us this great story. There was this bank that counted regularly because every week 2 fine Italian gentlemen would walk in with huge suitcases of $100 American bills. And the bank used that money to be able to give it out to the old ladies who were snowbirds and going down to Florida. And one week the guys didn't show up, and the old ladies didn't have their cash, and the bank was calling these 2 gentlemen saying, when are you showing up with the money, right? So that's a good example of willful blindness. And I want to end by showing you a short clip when it comes to almost a pathological inability for people who are engaged in money laundering. Martin Chambers was at one point a respected lawyer in Vancouver, had many, many clients. He was eventually charged with various offenses, and at one point, after years and years of investigation, the RCMP could not get him, so they worked with the FBI, did a sting, which you'll see part of, in Florida, and were eventually able to charge him with money laundering. He was sentenced to 17 years for money laundering cocaine money, or what he thought was cocaine money, tied to the Hells Angels. I'm going to show you an excerpt, hope the audio will work, of our documentary where you'll see his, well, just watch his reaction to the obvious evidence, and just imagine if this was a lawyer or a banker you'll meet, this is how people react when faced with the strong proof of money laundering and how they twist it in their own minds. Look at the pathology going on here. Now, that was filmed in his jail cell. The next day he walked into court. He was sentenced to 17 years. Yeah, put it back to full. There we go. Just, he was sentenced to 17 years. Here's an interesting after word. The police officer, Bill Miker, who you see in that documentary, was drummed out or had to leave the RCMP under uncertain circumstances. And Martin Chambers has now filed an appeal which in part states that Bill Miker was having an affair with the presiding judge at some point in the proceedings or after the court proceedings. So it just shows how stories you follow take an amazing amount of twists and turns. So I'll leave you with that, and of course I'm available for questions. If you need any more information, that's my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating to watch. Last but certainly not least, Frederick Martens is going to talk to us about some of his experiences in actually going after corrupt public officials and the twists and turns that involved. So, Frederick.
Yeah, first let me thank the Nathanson Center for being invited here. I appreciate the opportunity. At 50 years of investigation, you can see how old I am at this point, okay? So you took a retread out and put them out here. And Margaret, she's been around forever, okay? I go back to 1975 and she's still in the business. God bless her. I'm going to give you a Reader's Digest version of an investigation of an attorney general, okay? And this is a Reader's Digest version. I believe the papers are going to be produced that gets into all the nuances that you're going to face when you conduct an investigation of a public official, never mind an attorney general. we were essentially put out of business for conducting that investigation. So when I heard Margaret and Julian wonder why the police don't conduct these investigations, it's quite logical why they don't conduct them. Your career is over when you conduct these investigations. It's finished. The mandate of 20 years ago, the Crime Commission was put out of business, 20 years ago this year, actually. The mandate of the Crime Commission was simple: investigate organized crime and public corruption. It was a mandate that the legislature put onto the Crime Commission. Before I get into the case, though, let me give you 3 things that you have to consider before you even contemplate investigating public corruption. The first is, are you a politically independent agency? Because if you're not politically independent, I can assure you, you will not get to base 1 on an investigation of public corruption. Secondly, do the people who are in charge of your organization, agency, have the political will to do the investigation? Because I can assure you, in the course of that investigation, friends of the people that are your bosses will come up in that investigation, and they'll question whether or not they should have even gone ahead with this investigation. And lastly, you better have patience. You will not conduct an investigation of public corruption in 1 week, 1 year, 1 month, okay? It's not gonna happen. Usually they take 2 to 3 years. Ours took 2.5 years. So unless you meet those 3 criteria, I suggest forget conducting political corruption investigations. Let me give you how our investigation began. It began very simply. 2 investigators went out and asked a person who had been convicted of extortion as to whether he knew anything about public corruption in Pennsylvania. Now, he had been in prison for about 60 days awaiting final sentencing for his extortion case. He looked at the 2 investigators and said to them, "Do I know anything about public corruption? I made Ernie Priate the Attorney General of Pennsylvania." I made Ernie Priate the Attorney General of Pennsylvania. Man's name was Elmo Baldessari. Elmo was a local crime boss. He wasn't a member of the mafia. He was a local crime boss who basically controlled that area of the state. Mob people went to him to get things done. He was a very powerful guy. Made the statement, "I made Ernie Priate the Attorney General." Well, what did you do to make him the Attorney General? I put together all the video poker vendors in Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania. I made them all come together, and I said, "Look, we got to donate to Priate's campaign. Priate will not bother us if we donate to his campaign. So I want everybody's going to have to give so much money to me, and I'll take care of it with Ernie." Now, you got to understand, you're dealing with an attorney general who's very charismatic. He had a hell of a record as a prosecutor. He virtually put 5 people on death row. He was a Vietnam War veteran. He was very personable. He could deal with politicians. He was a politician in many respects himself. So he was a very, very interesting person to have an extortionist make an allegation against. And I say interesting in terms of this isn't somebody you're going to roll over. Here we've got a convicted extortionist making an allegation against a sitting attorney general. What do you do with it? Well, when I first got the call, I called the chairman of the commission up. He was an attorney. And I said, "Mike," I says, "you're not going to believe this, but we just interviewed Elmo Baldessari, and he's claiming he made Ernie Priate the Attorney General." Mike says, "Well, what did he say?" I said, "Well, he laid out an entire scheme in which he was they were extorting video poker vendors in the county to kick back campaign contributions to Priate in order for him to be re-elected a district attorney and ultimately as Attorney General. And it went over a 4 or 5 year period of time. I use Elmo Baldessari as an example of why it's so important to develop sources of information. Okay, Elmo was a source of information, okay? He provided this scheme that was laid out, but that's not going to be enough in a public corruption investigation, especially an extortionist versus an attorney general. So what we had to do is we had to corroborate what he was saying. And corroborating what he was saying would take a lot of time. First of all, we had to interview all the video poker vendors. We had to go out there and interview them and determine whether or not they were telling the truth. And even if they were telling the truth, they were tainted sources or corrupted sources. Most of them had criminal convictions for gambling. We had to develop corroboration in terms of records, campaign finance records that had to be filed by Beare at that point. It had to be filed with the state. We had to get into his campaign finance accounts that were held by the banks. All of this took a lot of forensic accounting. So we had a big job ahead of us. So when I talked to the chairman of the commission, Mike Riley, I said, Mike, you know, this isn't going to be an easy investigation. It's going to take a long time. And I'll be honest, I come from New Jersey, and I've been through these investigations, and nobody wins in these investigations. And to this day, and it's over 22 years later, I remember Mike's words to me. Freddie, do you have any doubt that we're dealing with an evil man? Evil? I didn't quite think of it in terms of the term evil. He says, let's start the investigation and let's see where it ends up. So we began the investigation. Now, the Crime Commission had the power to subpoena witnesses. We had the power to give immunity to witnesses. We also were able to swear in witnesses, put them under oath. So we were able to collect a lot of information over the course of 2.5 years through the subpoena powers that we had and through the ability to give immunity to witnesses if we needed to. What we didn't have was prosecutorial authority, which no police agency has, I might point out. We had to develop a case against a sitting attorney general that could not be given to a local district attorney. He's not going to prosecute a sitting attorney general. The attorney general's office certainly isn't going to prosecute the attorney general. So we only had one avenue to provide this evidence if we were able to get it. We only had one avenue to give it to, and that was the federal authorities. The problem was that the Attorney General sat on the United States Attorney General's Policy Drug Task Force. Okay, so he had a relationship with the federal authorities as well. So the question there was, even if we've got the evidence, are we going to be able to give it to the federal authorities, and will they go ahead with it? There's a lot of dynamics going on here. Now, in the course of conducting a public corruption investigation, you can be assured of one thing. The lawyers that represent the people involved will be feeding information back to the various actors in this drama. The Attorney General, in this case, Beare, will have his own group of lawyers attacking you every which way, as well as having members of the legislature, whom he was very close to, attacking you as well. Beare lobbied the legislature to put us out of business. He lobbied people in his own party, and he lobbied people in the opposition party to get rid of us. The legislature would hold hearings. They would call us in. They would want to know what we were doing in terms of the investigation. We had an obligation to answer to the legislature, but we would, of course, use the excuse that, look, we can't get into it because we're not sure how accurate the information is, and we don't want to malign the Attorney General or anybody else during this investigation. So they would continuously bring us in and try to get as much information out of us as to where this investigation was going. They would also make claims that we were using people who had been corrupted, witnesses that were corrupted, witnesses that were tainted, which we were. There was no doubt about it. The witnesses we were using had been charged with crimes. They had been involved in criminal activity. These are the people who were telling us what's going on. Claimed we were on a witch hunt, that we were just going after the Attorney General because the Attorney General was trying to put us out of business. They claimed hearsay. We were just relying on hearsay information. We had nothing to back up anything these people were saying. They then played the ethnicity card, that we were going after the Attorney General because he was an Italian, and that we had an anti-Italian bias on the commission. Another point, we were going after the Attorney General because we were the arm of the Democratic political party. The legislature bought all of Preate's arguments and gave us, after a year and a half of investigation, gave us 1 year to complete the investigation, at which time all funding to the commission would be eliminated. In other words, we would be put out of business. They gave us 1 year to finish it up. Now, in the course of this investigation, to basically back up a little bit what Julian was saying, the media was involved. Now, the media is a very interesting piece of the equation. I might point out, if you don't have the media on your side in a public corruption investigation, you are finished. That could be a fourth imperative. But the media got involved, and a reporter by the name of Fred Cusick had developed information independent of the Crime Commission as to these payoffs that were being made by these video poker vendors against the providing the Attorney General with. Cusick would bring this to his editors, and sooner or later, Preate was able to get to the editors and the management of the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of the better newspapers in the country, and convinced them that Cusick had a vendetta against the Attorney General. And they actually removed Cusick from the investigation and put him out to pasture in some rural country to count the sheep. That was basically his job, count the sheep. He was not to touch anything involving the Preate investigation. So the media, played a very interesting role in basically backing up the Attorney General. Cusick was sidelined. We, of course, could not go to the media and tell them what we knew, because we had prohibitions against releasing this information without being called for by the legislature. So we couldn't provide the media with any of this information. As the investigation, and again, this is a thumbnail Reader's Digest version, as the investigation was concluding and we felt we had sufficient information to bring a racketeering case against the sitting Attorney General, but we couldn't get this information out, I had met with Cusick. And I said, his first name was Fred. I said, Fred, we've got information that, the Attorney General was this, that. He said, I'm going to be honest with you, I can't touch it. He says, for me to do anything with that information with my newspaper, he says, they'll crucify me, because I've already been told that I have a bias against the sitting Attorney General. He says, but let me see what I can do. He says, I know a head of a convicted felon who was very much involved in politics in the Attorney General's party, who doesn't like the Attorney General, I might add. Let me sit down with him. He sits down with this convicted felon, who was the head of the party at the time, before he got convicted. And one day I get a phone call from a state senator demanding our information. I want everything you have. I'll be in your office at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I called the chairman of the commission up. I said, Mike, I says, so-and-so senator called up. He wants all the information. He says, well, as long as he's asking for it, give it to him. That's how we got our information out. It took a convicted felon for us to get our information out because we couldn't get it out any other way. The information was subsequently released by this senator, and hearings were called, and needless to say, these hearings were sideshows. I mean, Beare brought in former sitting Supreme Court justices to defend them. They had to be escorted out of the room because the room went in chaos. There was all kinds of shouting going on in the room. All kinds of shenanigans were happening at that point. But we were lucky in certain ways, okay? And luck plays a big role in any of these investigations, okay? I often say I'd rather have luck than skill. The first thing that played to our advantage was when the Attorney General knew we were looking at his campaign finance reports, he went back over his old reports, and he was having trouble reconciling $150,000 in cash in his reports. Nobody could find out how did this cash get into the reports? Who did it get into his campaign fund? Where did it come from? And he redoes his campaign finance reports. Needless to say, when he redoes his campaign finance reports, it extends the statute of limitations, which had already run out. So the statute of limitations was 5 years. It had run out. The reports are redone. It starts up the statute of limitations because those reports were equally as false because he couldn't account for this $150,000 in cash. The second piece of luck we had was the U.S. Attorney went from a Republican administration to a Democratic administration. The U.S. Attorney changed when Bill Clinton was elected the president. So we end up with a democratically appointed U.S. Attorney who would take this case, okay, and go ahead and prosecute it. We also received anonymous documents through the mail of a meeting that occurred before an indictment of these video poker vendors was made, in which these video poker vendors, their attorneys were brought in, and they were sat down and they said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to let the corporations plead guilty and let the individuals disappear. Does anybody have an objection to this? Now, what defense attorney isn't going to take that deal? But this was all written down on a report that several of the defense attorneys had written. And all of a sudden, through the mail, we got a copy of that meeting. And we were able to bring in deputy attorney generals who we were able to question as to what occurred at this meeting. And they couldn't deny the fact that they were offered a deal to these video poker vendors for the corporations to plead guilty and the individuals walk scot-free. Well, why would you offer such a deal if they're not asking for it? Why would you offer to give them a deal that they're not even asking for? Well, the reason they did it was to cover up this case and hope it went away and nobody would talk about it. So there was a certain amount of luck that involved this investigation at the end that we were able to basically leverage in the investigation. We went out of business on June 30th, 1994, but we had all this information that we had collected through both interviews, through sworn testimony, and through records that we were fortunate enough to have gotten from both the banks and from the campaign. And we were able to put the case together. It was basically a racketeering case against a sitting attorney general, his brother, his one brother who was a lawyer, and his other brother who was an accountant, who all were on his campaign. When the U.S. attorney approached the attorney general at that point and showed him the information, the deal was cut that he would plead guilty to 1 count of mail fraud if his brothers would get off. So they cut a deal with him. He pled guilty to 1 count of mail fraud and served 14 months in prison, in federal prison. And his brothers were basically let off the case, okay? Today, he practices law in Scranton, Pennsylvania, convicted felon. So it goes to show you, as much as you can try to do these investigations, okay, and the time involved in these investigations, at the end of the day, you question whether or not you did the right thing. And the only thing you can look at and say is, hey, that's what the job required. You did it. 50 people lost their jobs over it. Went on to other pastures, greener pastures in some cases. And you sit here and I listen to these talks on corruption, and why doesn't anybody do anything? Why does everybody know what's going on? Everybody knew what was going on with this. This was not a big secret. I mean, here you got video poker vendors, over 100 of them, kicking back cash, hundreds and hundreds of dollars every week in order to keep operating. Everybody knew what was going on, but nobody did anything. And one can say we were stupid enough to do it, or we did our job, whichever way you want to look at it. But at the end of the day, these are lethal investigations. You're not going to walk away whole after an investigation of public corruption. We called it a murder-suicide. And essentially that's what it was. It was a murder-suicide. You're not going to walk away whole after a public corruption investigation. There's few winners and many losers. So, and that's not to scare you from doing it. Just understand your career is going to be quite limited in terms of how far you're going to go in law enforcement when you begin the corruption investigation. So that's a abbreviated Reader's Digest version. My paper lays it all out, okay? Names, because I don't have to worry about names because there's no libel, it's all fact. I might point out that the people that came at us in the legislature, every one of those people are either in jail today, not because of this case, in jail today, or have served time in jail. Virtually every one of those people that came after us through the legislature ended up going to prison themselves. And look, Beare had a great argument with these legislators. I mean, that would be the argument I would use. His argument was simply, if they can do this to me, think of what they can do to you. That's a great argument, especially if you're a corrupt legislator. If they can do this to me, think of what they can do to you. We got to get rid of these guys. And they got rid of us over that particular case. So you don't win in these investigations. I go back, I just finished up my manuscript on a book I'm doing. I go back to a famous case in the country called Abscam. And a lot of people question whether Abscam was ethically right and should have been done and everything. But the agent at the end of that, when I was doing my research on it, he said, we thought we were going to get praise for what we did. We caught all these corrupt legislators who were passing legislation, you know, in order to, and getting money to pass certain legislation to help these people. We thought we were going to get credit for that. He says, all we did was get a shellacking by Congress. And they did. They cut them back in their budget. The FBI at that time, they cut them back in what they could do. He says, we were totally perplexed on what we did wrong. And that's how you'll end up in a corruption investigation. Black will be white and white will be black. You'll never figure out what happened at the end because it just gets so convoluted and perverted. So for those young people out here, because I'm probably the oldest one in the group, I suspect older than you too, Julian. Okay, I know I'm older than Margaret. I can assure you that if you're going to go into this field, you better go in with your eyes wide open because you're going to come out with them wide open, I can assure you, at the end of it. With that, let me leave it open to questions.
All right, very interesting. Frederick put the question, I think Margaret put the question, both in the United States and in Canada, you've got countries that are wide open with a strong tradition of a robust free press. You have institutions that work. You have public prosecutors who are independent or supposed to be. You have judges who are independent or supposed to be, and yet in both countries, corruption is rife. And it's a challenge for countries like the US and Canada that have a lot of resources. You can imagine for the United Nations, where we deal with countries that don't have a lot of resources, how difficult it really is to try to see any real progress on fighting against corruption. But in any event, I'm sure many of you have comments and questions. And the first one, the gentleman, please. Would you identify yourself before you ask a question?
Jerry Ferguson. I just have two quick information questions. One from Julian. The clip you showed us, was it Fifth Estate on the murder, the money laundering chain?
That was a documentary. It was with Gillian Findlay, who's a host on the Fifth Estate. But at the time, we did that for a show called Disclosure.
Okay. And do you think that's still archived? I'm just interested in...
I'm pretty sure not, unfortunately.
Okay.
I had to dig around a lot to find it.
I'm a law professor, and I'd very much like to get access to that, so maybe I'll send you an email. Maybe you can send me to somebody. The other question was, I was just curious I heard you use the word Freddie. I'm an old guy like you, so I'll use that. What do you know about the ultimate plea bargain that was reached? In light of all the evidence they had, it seemed to be a pretty lenient plea bargain, one count, 14 months. Why did that happen, if you know?
Well, again, here, the nuances of the law. You got a sitting attorney general, extremely charismatic, okay? Do we bring the case against him, or do we get him out of office? What's the goal here? If we bring the case, it's possible he could beat the case, because all the witnesses are going to be tainted. Okay, there may be 15 witnesses, but they're all tainted. Or do we take the best deal we can, get him out of office, serves his 14 months, he's a convicted felon at this point, can't run for office again. Do we just get the problem out? And I think probably if you look at it in those terms, it probably was a good decision, okay? Would have we loved to have seen a racketeering case, go to trial, conviction, do 20, 25 years? Of course you would. But at the end of the day, you've got a sitting attorney general. That's a powerful position, especially him, because he was very, very good on his feet. And they would have chewed up the witnesses. The witnesses would have got chewed up by the defense attorneys. That doesn't mean they weren't telling the truth, by the way. All that means is their credibility would have been certainly suspect. I think the evidence in the records would have been overwhelming, but his claim would have been, I didn't control those records. That was controlled by my brother. That was controlled by... Now, in a racketeering indictment, all three would have been sitting there. And the deal he cut was basically, you let my brothers go, I'll leave office and serve my time. I think it was probably the best deal at the time.
Could I just add one thing to that? Not in terms of the U.S., but I was interested in some of the people in Quebec who were convicted and who did get sentences. The sentences were, again, almost nothing. And part of the explanation was, well, the person already had to wear shame. So you get this idea of the white-collar criminal who can be hobnobbing with mobsters and be up to his or her, his in all of these cases, ears in corruption. But, he's sort of, this punishment has already been done. They had to sort of wear shame. So it really does throw it open to... we want the police to do these cases, but it's going to be really frustrating at the end.
Okay, thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Cynthia Williams, and I'm a professor of law here at Osgoode Hall Law School. And I have to say, in one sense, I'm having a bit of a crisis of faith in the rule of law, right? Because we are hearing about the public enforcement mechanisms, the police and U.S. attorneys and attorney generals, and looking at some of the incentives that are affecting them, and then their inability to overcome some of those incentives, negative incentives. Mr. Martens talks about this as, being career ending. You don't win. So that leads me to wonder whether maybe we need some sort of mechanisms comparable to what we have in my field, which is corporate law. We have an ability for outsiders, not total outsiders, shareholders, to cause litigation to go forward when the litigation is against the board of directors, right? Those who have the governance power normally to get these enforcement mechanisms going within the corporation. So could there be some kind of comparable ability of, citizens, broader standing or derivative litigation, in some sense, to bring these cases? But my second question, possibly a little more, pragmatic, is to Mr. Sher. When we see the importance of investigative journalism and getting some of these corruption issues brought to light, what concerns might you have given the changes in the media, the structure of media, and the newspapers failing daily, and corporate ownership and that sort of thing? Thank you.
I think both questions are connected in that there were some citizens who brought forward a complaint of, I think the company's name was Blackfire. It's a Canadian mining company that got into controversy over a killing of an anti-mining activist. And it took a lot of pressure from the citizens. They tried to get the Canadian government and the RCMP to take some action. For the longest time, the RCMP, like many other police forces, didn't have a very robust corruption investigation squad. They've now set one up in Ottawa, Calgary, and elsewhere. Although as far as I know, its mandate is for foreign corruption. It does not deal with domestic corruption, which already says something interesting. And the point is, when you speak to those officers or people like that, and as our last speaker pointed out, it's very hard and frustrating work. So journalistically, that's the same problem. The thing with investigative journalism, whether you're doing corruption or anything else, is it takes time. You're going to get a lot of flack. It takes a lot of money. And the companies who back you up, whether it's the CBC or the newspapers, have to be willing, if you go after corruption, you are going to get sued, or you're certainly going to deal with very high-powered lawyers on the other side. So it's much easier to do a murder story or a kidnapping story that can still be investigative. Going after big business, crooks, whether they're wearing pinstripe suits or leather jackets, is very, very difficult and frustrating. So the bad news is, the media industry across the country and in the U.S., I think the statistics in the U.S., the total number of journalists is dropped by a third. Many of the investigative teams that used to exist in newspapers and media have been cut back. At the CBC right now, aside from the massive cutbacks that we're facing, so far at the Fifth Estate, we've been largely protected, but I don't know how much longer that will last. My colleagues at the Star still have a robust investigative team, so does the Globe and Mail, but there are a few other islands where that kind of investigation is going on. So, you need the public support to do that.
What Julian's saying is the free press isn't really free.
Yeah. It's not. One, because it costs a lot, and two, it's owned by at times, not the CBC, but it's owned at times by interests who don't look very favorable. Just as this is a small example, but our last story last week was on General Motors and the ignition switches that are literally killing people across North America, and the fact that General Motors kept it secret. And we also looked quite critically at Transport Canada. That wasn't corruption, but it certainly is a corruption of public morals. Well, as a matter of course, we notify and we pull all the automotive ads on the show where that runs. Because we know they're going to be furious. But it does create a conflict of interest, and what if corporations want us to take it out more often? We had to do the same thing when we investigated Walmart and Joe Fresh, Loblaws, for the factory collapse in Bangladesh. We had to pull their ads off of our show. And the same with Scotiabank. You're richer than you think. We had to make sure the Scotiabank ads didn't run when we broadcast our money laundering show.
Kind of shocked they didn't pull them.
All right. That's all.
So my question is actually directly related, and it's for Julian. As you pointed out, you lead, or you work for one of the very few investigative journalism show in the country, definitely one of the best. That show is put forward by a public broadcaster, which gets most of its money from taxpayers, but that is the government, right? Have you ever felt, and obviously this is being recorded, there's only so much you can tell us, that your role has been constrained by that fact, the fact that you're working for a crown corporation, which has some ties to the government, if only through its budget, right? Especially in terms of reporting on the government itself. You know, we've seen various journalists, you know, Normand Lester on the side of Radio-Canada or others, even on the CBC side, sometimes making remarks to this effect. Has this affected the Fifth Estate? How does it color the picture of the CBC as a whole? Because you play a very important role as an arm of the government, as it were.
The short answer is no. We have never felt certainly any direct pressure from the government or anybody else as a Crown Corporation. But when we go after Transport Canada or Environment Canada or a government, be it Liberal or Conservative or provincial NDP governments, they are as angry as us as whether it's General Motors or Walmart. And we do feel that pressure. I was on the national on Tuesday with Peter Mansbridge. We had a media panel about protecting sources, and I showed a document that was obtained by La Presse. They passed it on to us from Access to Information, that showed that Transport Canada, another Crown, you know, basically a government department, had hired an outside private investigator to investigate the Fifth Estate, to find out who our sources were in a story we had done that looked at government problems when it came to airline security. So we know that, frankly, to use an unpoetic word, that we piss off the government of any political stripe when we investigate, and that will face consequences, particularly when we're investigating a government that holds the purse strings to the CBC. So I don't think it's any secret that there are many people in government of all political persuasions who don't like us. But, you know, if I wanted friends, I'd get a dog, and I already have a dog. So, you know, that's not our job to, you know, make friends of people in power, and I can't control what they do. But yeah, you think twice when you go after a big bank, and you think twice when you go after a big government, and you have to think twice when you go after an attorney general. But you still do it.
So I guess I wanted to go at it, the same question, but from another direction, which is having spent some time practicing in the United States and practicing in Canada, and I'm mostly a competition lawyer, I just get the impression that Canadians don't care about these issues. Maybe Quebec is separate with the Charbonneau inquiry and the other one involving the Liberal government. But relative to the United States, it just seems to me these corruption issues really don't capture the public imagination, and people don't get really incensed. So the problem, it seems to me, Julian, is not so much whether you're constrained by the government owning you, but just by a public that is so interested in peace, order, and good government that they really couldn't care less about corruption. Any reaction?
Yeah, the others could speak to that. I think to some degree that's true, but I think certainly if you're a prosecutor or if you're professors, or in my case, if you're a storyteller, you have to make people care. You know, not a lot of people cared about a bunch of foreigners getting killed in a factory that Canadian companies were financing to get cheap clothes, but we made them care. We won the International Emmy a few weeks ago for that story by making them care. You know, in Quebec, you knew my colleagues at Enquête had done their job when one of the most popular Halloween costumes at the time, I think it was last year, was Monsieur 3%, Monsieur 3%, you know, who was taking a commission on the corruption. So it had entered the public psyche. And one of the ways they did that is they showed people, this is what it means for your tax dollars. I mean, they brought it down. It wasn't just, you know, when Rizzuto can pay off construction companies and we still have some of the worst roads, this is what it means for you. So I think people do care, but you're right, you do have to show them what it means and what the consequences are for them as citizens and also for us as a country.
Margaret, do people care in Canada?
I was just going to say, in terms of, I mean, a lot of people have been, in fact, focusing on the Quebec inquiry. But why haven't there been more inquiries? Why hasn't there been one in Ontario? Why inquiries cost a lot of money and all the rest of it? I guess until you actually have an inquiry, so you can hold up things like, you know, what kind of percentage goes, and you do have those wonderful quotes by people saying, you know, the most bizarre, threatening things, then people, at least people in Quebec. I don't know if I ask my students here how aware they are of the inquiry in Quebec. I think I'd be disappointed in terms of sort of what even awareness of that is. Some of us think that there needs to be a Canada-wide inquiry into police corruption, like sort of quite widely. What's the chances of that? Likely negligible. And Canada is a country that we do have quite a number of inquiries of one sort or another. All of like the innocence inquiries, things like that, seem to be able to grab the public attention, more so than something that may just sound sort of vague and that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't affect people until the bridge falls down or the building falls down, or again the kind of testimony that has come out of Quebec. So maybe by and large we don't care as much. When I guess there's one comment sort of related to that. Even though it didn't help the Pennsylvania Crime Commission in terms of surviving, our police, of course, do not have, they can not compel witnesses. You cannot coerce sort of testimony. Some of us talk about possibly the need for a standing crime commission, crime and corruption commission that would have a degree of independence and be there so that when something happened, there would be a focus that actually could make people care about it. But right now, when something happens, you have to start from scratch, or you have to rely on the media, or you have to whatever. So I don't know whether that's sort of the kind of answer. But to ask the police to do these investigations without the powers that a crime commission has adds to the difficulty.
So, final question, sir.
Yeah, Stan McCooch. I'm a speaker this afternoon. And I guess we're here in a law school, and so I'm wondering, particularly with respect to telling the story, if there is, or do you have concerns about the presumption of innocence, getting the story out, getting the interest going. I've watched many disclosure quite often. I've watched the Fifth Estate. Do you have concerns about that? I'm sure you have concerns about defamation, and you must have your programs vetted by lawyers to deal with that issue. But it's that other part of, do you feel that sometimes you're unfair to people, or that those values that are fundamental to the law, and in fact, again, not being required to give evidence about yourself to the extent that that's there, does that concern you?
It does. My wife once did a story, she's a journalist, on, I forget his name, but he's a famous Newfoundland judge, and it was on the definition of beyond reasonable doubt. And he turned to the jury, apparently, and you'll have to excuse my French, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, beyond reasonable doubt means you better be fucking sure." Now, the point is, it's the same with us, right? When we broadcast something, we have to go beyond reasonable doubt. I remember that morning, it was a Monday morning, we were doing our story on the Weasel and Claude Savoie, and somebody rushed into the office and said, "Claude Savoie has just killed himself," right? So I use that when I speak to journalism students. These are lives we're playing with. These are people's lives, their careers. You had better be effing sure about what you're saying and what you're reporting, because there are lives that are at stake. So for sure, you think about that all the time. Yes, at the CBC and most other places I've worked at, lawyer is a verb for us, it's not a noun. We have to get our stuff lawyered. We're very, very careful. We sometimes make mistakes. We try to correct them when we make them. But you know, when we make accusations, and particularly when people's lives are at stake, I think we take all the care that is required. We are helped now by the new law, the responsible communication law. Since this is a law faculty, I guess we can bore people a bit, but the new responsible communication law gives us a lot more leeway, because if we've done everything possible to get Rob Ford or anybody else who's under our investigation to answer specific allegations that we have, and we say, we don't know the answer to these questions, please help us, then we have a certain measure of protection, even if we've made a mistake, which we still always try to avoid.
All right, I would like to thank the three panelists for their excellent presentations. I thank the audience for a lot of good questions.